There is a room in Iraq that no one who entered ever left the same, if they left at all. Behind the official speeches and the military parades, there existed a system of punishment so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that survivors struggled to find words for what they witnessed. This is not a story about one man. It is a story about a machine built to destroy, and the thousands of human beings fed into it. To understand what Saddam Hussein did to those who opposed him, you first have to understand how he built the system that made it possible. When the Ba'ath Party came to power in Iraq in 1968, Saddam Hussein was not yet the country's top leader, but he was already the man in charge of internal security. He oversaw the Jihaz al-Qas, the secret intelligence apparatus that would eventually evolve into one of the most feared security networks in the Middle East. From his early days, Saddam understood something clearly. Power is not maintained through loyalty alone. It is maintained through fear, and fear requires demonstration. By the time he officially became president in 1979, the infrastructure of repression was already in place. There were multiple overlapping security agencies: the Mukhabarat, the Amn al-Qas, the Istikhbarat, each watching the others, each reporting directly to Saddam or his inner circle. This redundancy was intentional. It meant that no single agency could ever grow powerful enough to threaten him, and it meant that dissent had nowhere to hide. What made this system uniquely horrifying was not simply that it punished enemies, it punished families, it punished neighbors, it punished colleagues who failed to report suspicious behavior. The logic was simple and brutal. If everyone around you is responsible for your loyalty, then everyone around you becomes a potential informant. Trust collapses, community collapses, and in that collapse, organized resistance becomes almost impossible. Detention facilities were spread across the country. Some were well known. Abu Ghraib prison, located west of Baghdad, became one of the most notorious. But many were hidden in basements, military compounds, and converted government buildings. People could be taken at any hour, without warning, without charges, without any official acknowledgement that they had been detained at all. Families would sometimes spend years not knowing whether their relatives were alive or dead. The network also extended into every professional sector. Teachers, physicians, engineers, military officers, all were expected to demonstrate their loyalty to the party on a continuous basis. Professional advancement was tied not just to competence, but to documented political reliability. Informants were embedded at every level of society: workplaces, universities, mosques, neighborhood committees. The effect was a society in which political conversation became something conducted in absolute whispers, if at all. Children were not exempt from the system. Schools incorporated political education that encouraged students to report the private conversations of their parents and relatives. Youth organizations modeled on Soviet-era structures were established to build loyalty from an early age. The regime understood that long-term stability required shaping the next generation, and it pursued that goal with considerable resources. What gave this entire structure its particular character was the role of Saddam Hussein's own family and tribal network. Key security positions were filled by members of the Tikriti clan, relatives and associates from his hometown of Tikrit, whose personal loyalty to him was considered the only reliable guarantee of their trustworthiness. This meant that the most sensitive levers of repression were held by people whose fates were bound to his. They had every incentive to maintain the system because the alternative, a government not controlled by Saddam, was one in which they had no protection. Survivors who were eventually released, or who managed to flee Iraq entirely, described a world operating on its own rules, a parallel reality in which the laws of ordinary life did not apply, and where the capacity of human beings to inflict suffering on one another was tested to its outermost limits. This was the world that Saddam Hussein built, and what happened inside it would take decades to fully come to light. Coming up, the methods themselves. What happened inside those facilities is documented, recorded, and far worse than most people know. Of all the detention facilities that operated under Saddam Hussein's government, Abu Ghraib prison was the most infamous. Built in the 1960s, the prison sits roughly 30 kilometers west of Baghdad. At its peak during Saddam's rule, it held tens of thousands of prisoners, political detainees, alleged criminals, members of ethnic and religious minorities targeted by the regime, and ordinary civilians swept up in mass arrest campaigns. The conditions inside were catastrophic by any standard. Overcrowding was severe. Access to clean water, food, and basic sanitation was minimal or non-existent for large portions of the prison population. But overcrowding and deprivation were only the beginning. Executions at Abu Ghraib were carried out on a scale that was, for many years, difficult for the outside world to fully grasp. Former inmates and staff who later gave testimony described weekly, and at times daily, hangings conducted inside the facility. These were not individual executions carried out after formal trials. They were mass events. Groups of prisoners would be taken from their cells in the night, and by morning, they were gone. Their deaths were not announced, their families were not notified. One of the most disturbing patterns documented by human rights investigators was the practice of sending families a bill for the cost of the execution after their relative had already been killed. This was not an accident of bureaucracy. It was a deliberate act of humiliation, a final demonstration of the state's total power over life and death, and over the grief of those left behind. The methods of execution used at Abu Ghraib and across the Iraqi detention system under Saddam were varied, and they were selected with purpose. Hanging was the most common method for formal executions, but accounts from survivors and later investigations by organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, documented a range of methods used during interrogation and punishment that went far beyond any recognizable legal framework. Electric shock was widely reported, applied to detainees during interrogation to extract confessions or information. Sleep deprivation was systematic. Detainees described being kept in complete isolation for extended periods, losing track of time, losing the ability to distinguish reality from hallucination. Burning was documented. Detainees described cigarette burns and, in some accounts, more severe forms of burning applied as punishment. Drowning, holding a prisoner's head underwater until the point just before death, then pulling them back, was described by multiple survivors as a standard interrogation technique. Particularly disturbing were accounts involving medical personnel. In some facilities, doctors and medical staff were reported to be present not to provide care, but to monitor prisoners during torture sessions, ensuring that the subject remained alive long enough for questioning to continue. The involvement of trained medical professionals in these procedures represented one of the deepest corruptions of the system. Physical mutilation was also documented. Amputations, described by the regime as punishment for theft or other crimes under its interpretation of Islamic law, were carried out as public or semi-public events in certain periods. Former health officials who later spoke to investigators described being compelled to perform or witness these procedures under direct orders from security forces. Branding was reported. Prisoners described having marks cut or burned into their bodies, a physical record of their status as enemies of the state, carried on their skin for the rest of their lives. The psychological dimension of punishment was as calculated as the physical. Prisoners were forced to witness the torture of family members, including children, in order to break their resistance. This technique, documented in testimony collected by investigators after 2003, was considered particularly effective by those running the system because it targeted not just the individual, but their most fundamental human attachments. Abu Ghraib was not unique. Similar conditions and similar methods were documented at facilities including the Radwaniyah prison camp, the Hakimiyya and Najaba detention centers in Baghdad, and numerous military intelligence facilities across the country. But Abu Ghraib became the symbol, the name that, more than any other, came to represent what Saddam's Iraq did to human beings behind closed doors. But prisons were only one part of the story. What Saddam Hussein did in public, in front of crowds on national television, was something else entirely. For Saddam Hussein, punishment was never purely a private matter. Public executions served a specific and deliberate function in the political life of Ba'athist Iraq. They were performances, carefully staged demonstrations of the regime's absolute authority, designed to send a message not just to the condemned, but to everyone who witnessed it. And the audience was often very large. In the early years of his presidency, Saddam Hussein personally oversaw some of the most dramatic of these events. One of the most documented incidents in this regard occurred in July 1979, within days of Saddam formally becoming president. A meeting of senior Ba'ath Party officials was convened. In front of the assembled leadership, a list of alleged conspirators was read aloud. Those named were taken from the room immediately. What followed was an event that those present described as unlike anything they had experienced. Senior party members, men who had worked alongside Saddam for years, were executed, and in some accounts, other high-ranking officials were compelled to participate in the executions themselves. The message sent by that event was unmistakable. No position, no rank, no history of loyalty offered protection. Proximity to power was not a shield. It was, in some cases, the very thing that made a person a target. After that moment, the nature of Saddam's government was clear to everyone inside it. Public hangings in Iraq under Saddam were not confined to security facilities. They were carried out in city squares, in neighborhoods, at crossroads. Bodies were left displayed for extended periods afterward, sometimes for days, as a warning to those who passed by. In some documented cases, families were explicitly prohibited from retrieving the bodies of their executed relatives for burial. During the 1980s, as the regime intensified its campaign against Kurdish populations in northern Iraq and Shia communities in the south, public executions became more frequent and more visible. Village elders, religious leaders, teachers and doctors, people who represented community cohesion and the potential for organized identity, were targeted. Their deaths were meant to decapitate communities, to remove anyone who could serve as a center of gravity for resistance. It is worth pausing on the specific targeting of religious and intellectual figures, because it was not random. The regime understood that communities sustain themselves through shared memory and shared meaning, through scholars who transmit knowledge, through clerics who anchor identity, through teachers who raise the next generation. By systematically removing these people, the aim was not simply to punish. It was to hollow out the community's capacity to regenerate itself. This was a pattern repeated with careful consistency across multiple targeted populations throughout Saddam's rule. The Shia clergy of Najaf were a particular focus of this campaign. The Hawza, the centuries-old network of Islamic seminaries centered in Najaf, represented a form of independent authority that existed outside the state's control. Grand Ayatollah Mohammed Baqir al-Sadr, one of the most prominent Shia scholars in the world, was arrested in 1980 along with his sister, Bint al-Huda. Both were executed. Their deaths sent a message that reached far beyond Iraq, reverberating through Shia communities across the Muslim world. No title, no reputation, no level of religious authority offered protection. The Anfal campaign of 1988, directed primarily against Kurdish communities in northern Iraq, produced some of the most documented cases of mass killing under the regime. This campaign involved military operations, forced displacement, and mass executions carried out in remote desert locations. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Men and boys of fighting age were particularly targeted, but the killings extended to women, the elderly, and children. Mass graves discovered after 2003 across Iraq, particularly in the western desert regions and in southern Iraq, provided physical evidence of what had been documented in survivor testimony for years. The investigations carried out at these sites by forensic teams from multiple countries found bodies that bore clear evidence of execution, hands bound behind backs, gunshot wounds to the head. And the sites themselves were often enormous, containing hundreds or thousands of individuals. For those watching from outside Iraq, these images, the graves, the bones, the personal belongings scattered among them, were the most concrete possible evidence of what the regime had done. For Iraqi families, they were the answers to questions they had been asking for decades. What happened to specific communities, particularly the Kurds and the Shia, went beyond individual execution. It was organized, systematic, and it had a name. On March 16, 1988, the Kurdish town of Halabja in northeastern Iraq ceased to exist as it had been. Halabja was a city of roughly 80,000 people, situated near the Iranian border. During the Iran-Iraq War, Kurdish armed groups aligned with Iran had taken control of parts of the region. The Iraqi government used this as justification for what followed, but what followed was not a military operation against armed fighters. It was an attack on an entire civilian population. Iraqi aircraft flew over Halabja and dropped munitions containing a combination of chemical agents, including mustard gas, and nerve agents, including sarin and tabun. The attack lasted for several hours. People in the streets had no warning and no protection. The chemicals, heavier than air, settled into low-lying areas, into basements where people had taken shelter thinking they were safe, into the courtyards of homes. Survivors described a smell like apples and something sweet, the scent of certain chemical agents, followed by an inability to see, to breathe, to control their bodies. People died in the streets, in their homes, in the arms of relatives who were themselves dying. Animals died. Birds fell from the sky. The death toll from the Halabja attack is estimated at between 3,200 and 5,000 people killed in the immediate aftermath. Thousands more were injured, and the long-term health consequences, cancers, birth defects, respiratory diseases, continued to affect survivors and their descendants for generations. The international response at the time was muted in ways that would later become a source of significant controversy. In 1988, Iraq was still considered a strategic counterbalance to Iran in the region, and several Western governments were slow to condemn the attack or attribute responsibility clearly. Some officials attempted to suggest that Iranian forces might have been responsible, a claim that was later thoroughly discredited by military analysts and investigated by the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which concluded that Iraq was responsible based on the types of agents used and the direction of the attack. The gap between what was known and what was officially acknowledged in those years is part of the historical record. The Halabja attack was not an isolated incident. It was the most catastrophic single event in a broader campaign of chemical weapons use against Kurdish communities in northern Iraq. Investigators and historians have documented over 40 separate incidents of chemical weapons deployment against Kurdish villages between 1987 and 1988. The scale of this chemical campaign, directed against the regime's own civilian population, was, at the time, without precedent in the post-World War II era. Ali Hassan al-Majid, Saddam's cousin and the official placed in charge of the Anfal campaign, was later prosecuted and convicted for his role in ordering these attacks. Recordings of his internal communications survived, recordings in which he described his intentions toward the Kurdish population in terms that left no ambiguity about what was being authorized. The use of chemical weapons against civilian populations is prohibited under international law. The fact that this prohibition was violated so extensively over such a sustained period and against such a large number of people was central to the charges of crimes against humanity and genocide that were later brought against members of the former Iraqi government. For the survivors of Halabja, many of whom were children when the attack occurred, the decades that followed were defined by illness, loss, and the struggle to have what happened to them recognized and remembered. The town was rebuilt, but the wound it carries is never fully closed. The Kurds were not the only community to face organized violence. In the south, what happened after 1991 added another chapter to this history, one that is less known but equally devastating. When the Gulf War ended in February 1991 and Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait, something unexpected happened inside Iraq. Uprisings broke out simultaneously in the Kurdish north and the Shia-majority south. In city after city, Basra, Najaf, Karbala, Nasiriyah, crowds took to the streets. Regime installations were attacked. Local Ba'ath Party offices were overwhelmed. For a brief period, it appeared that Saddam Hussein's government might collapse from within. It did not. The regime recovered quickly. Republican Guard units, Saddam's most loyal and best-equipped military forces, were ordered south. What followed was a suppression campaign of extraordinary violence. In the city of Karbala, one of the holiest sites in Shia Islam, Republican Guard tanks moved directly into the sacred shrine district. The Imam Hussein Shrine and the Imam Abbas Shrine, sites of immense religious significance visited by millions of pilgrims, were damaged during the military operation. Fighters who had taken refuge inside were killed. Civilians who had joined or sheltered the uprising were killed. The pattern was repeated across the south. Villages were surrounded and shelled. Men were separated from their families and taken away. In many cases, they were never seen again. The mass graves discovered after 2003 in southern Iraq, sites like the Mahawil grave complex near Karbala, which contained an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 bodies, are directly linked to these events. What made the 1991 suppression particularly devastating was the speed and totality of it. The uprisings had lasted only a matter of weeks. The retaliation lasted much longer. Security sweeps continued for months. Shia religious leaders, the scholarly and clerical figures who formed the backbone of community life in southern Iraq, were hunted down. Many were executed. Others fled into exile in Iran and elsewhere. The marshes of southern Iraq, a vast wetland region that had been home to the marsh Arab communities for thousands of years, became both a refuge and a target. Tens of thousands of people fled into the marshes to escape the security forces. The regime's response was to drain them. A massive engineering project, carried out through the 1990s, diverted the rivers feeding the marshes. The wetlands shrank from their historic extent of roughly 20,000 square kilometers to a fraction of that size. The communities that had depended on them for their entire way of life were displaced, and many were captured and killed. The draining of the southern marshes was one of the most visible and verifiable acts of collective punishment carried out by the regime. Something that could be seen from space, documented in satellite images, and tracked over years. It remains one of the most severe environmental destructions deliberately carried out as an instrument of political repression in modern history. The United Nations Environment Program later estimated that over 90% of the original marsh ecosystem had been destroyed by the time Saddam Hussein's government fell in 2003. Restoration efforts began in the years that followed, and some portion of the marshlands has gradually returned. But the communities that live there, the culture, the way of life, the knowledge passed across generations, cannot be restored in the same way that water can be returned to a riverbed. What was lost in those years was irreplaceable, and the deliberateness of the decision that caused it places it squarely within the record of the regime's actions against its own people. Everything that has been documented so far, the prisons, the executions, the chemical attacks, the uprisings, eventually led to one moment. The moment when the system that Saddam Hussein built finally faced a reckoning. On December 30th, 2006, Saddam Hussein was executed by hanging in Baghdad. The road to that moment had begun 3 years earlier, when the United States-led coalition invaded Iraq in March 2003, and the government of Saddam Hussein collapsed within weeks. Saddam himself evaded capture for several months, living in hiding across various locations in northern Iraq. He was found on December 13, 2003, in a small underground hiding space, a hole in the ground roughly 2 meters deep, on a farm near the town of Ad-Dar, south of Tikrit. His capture was documented and photographed. The images, Saddam disheveled, being examined by a military doctor, were broadcast around the world. For many Iraqis, particularly those who had survived the decades of his rule, the sight of this man in that condition was almost impossible to process. For others, it was not enough. The trial of Saddam Hussein was conducted by the Iraqi Special Tribunal, later renamed the Supreme Iraqi Criminal Tribunal, a court established under Iraqi law specifically to try members of the former government for crimes against the Iraqi people. The process attracted significant international attention and criticism on procedural grounds. Multiple defense lawyers were killed during the trial period, and questions were raised about judicial independence. These criticisms were genuine and documented. The first case brought to verdict focused on the events in the town of Dujail in 1982. Following an assassination attempt against Saddam during a visit to the town, the regime's response was catastrophic and collective. 148 residents were executed. The entire town was razed. Thousands of inhabitants were deported to desert detention camps, where many died of heat, thirst, and illness. Date palm orchards that had sustained the community for generations were destroyed. In November 2006, Saddam Hussein was found guilty of crimes against humanity in connection with the Dujail killings and sentenced to death. He was executed approximately 6 weeks later. The execution itself was conducted by hanging and was recorded on a mobile phone by witnesses present in the room. That recording was leaked and circulated widely online within hours, despite official efforts to control its distribution. It showed a chaotic scene, guards taunting the condemned man, exchanges of words before the trapdoor opened. The manner of the execution drew criticism from governments and human rights organizations internationally, who noted that the circumstances fell well short of the standards expected for a lawful execution. Iraqi officials defended the proceeding. For Iraq, Saddam Hussein's death did not resolve the questions left by his decades in power. The mass graves were still being excavated, the survivors of chemical attacks were still living with the consequences. The families of the disappeared were still waiting for answers. Trials of other senior regime figures continued for years. Ali Hassan al-Majid, known internationally as Chemical Ali for his role in the Anfal campaign, was convicted and executed in 2010. Other senior Ba'ath Party and military figures received sentences of death or lengthy imprisonment. The accounting process is not complete. New evidence continues to be identified. Survivors continue to give testimony. Families continue to search for the remains of relatives who were taken and never returned. One of the witnesses to Saddam Hussein's trial later described the atmosphere in the courtroom during the verdict, the silence that fell over the room, and the expressions on the faces of survivors of the events being described, who had waited years to sit in that room and hear those words spoken aloud. What has been documented in this video represents some of what is known, some of what has been investigated, verified, and recorded. There are cases that remain incomplete. There are graves that have not been found. There are survivors whose testimony has never been formally collected. There are families who still do not know what happened to people they lost. The scale of what occurred in Iraq under Saddam Hussein's government from 1968 to 2003 is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of state-organized mass atrocity in the late 20th century. The documentation was not easy to compile. Much of it was gathered at great personal risk by journalists, human rights investigators, and survivors who chose to speak at a time when speaking was dangerous. When international human rights organizations first began collecting testimony from Iraqi exiles in the 1980s, the accounts seemed almost unbelievable, not because they were implausible, but because the scale was so vast and the Iraqi government denied everything so flatly. It took the fall of the regime and the opening of mass grave sites to provide the physical confirmation that matched what survivors had been saying for years. In some cases, the bodies of individuals named in survivor testimony were identified in grave sites through forensic analysis. Testimony and physical evidence converged. This convergence matters because it is a reminder of the importance of listening to survivors before the physical proof arrives. Across history, the pattern repeats. Those who live through state atrocities describe what happened are not believed, and years or decades later, the evidence emerges that confirms what they said. In Iraq, the gap between testimony and confirmation was measured in graves. History does not record itself. It is recorded by people who decide that what happened must not be forgotten, that the names, the numbers, and the methods must be spoken plainly so that the magnitude of what was done is not reduced to abstraction. The people who passed through Abu Ghraib, the people of Halabja, the families of the disappeared in the south, the communities driven from the marshes, they were not symbols. They were individuals with names and histories, and they deserve to be remembered as such. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.